Okay, so we're going to open up with a couple of videos. First, a brief Crystal video, and then I'm going to introduce Max to do his. Okay?
Crystal is Crystal and Kuttner, I think.
Is it? It's actually
Just Crystal.
It's
Okay.
just Crystal.
Okay, just Crystal.
Okay.
I'd be more than happy for conservatives to be judged by the results. I'm not forgetting it. I've defended the surge. I've defended Bush, and I've defended staying there. We can certainly afford it, and we should probably spend more, not less, I think, on voting. Look, it's not been the most competent administration in history. I don't think I need to defend the corporate dominance of everything in America. I'd be more than happy for conservatives to be judged by the results.
Now here's what I want you all to do for me. Don't believe the hype.
Okay. Great. Okay, I'm Cecile Richards, and I'm the president of Planned Parenthood, and I'm going to moderate this panel.
I'd be more than
Okay,
happy
thank you
for
very much.
conservatives
Thank
to be
you.
judged by the results.
And we're going to start out with a video of. Besides
I'm
the
not
video you just
forgetting
saw,
out. I've
by Max
defended the
Blumenthal,
surge. I've defended Bush, and I've
who is
defended
a regular
staying there.
contributor to The Nation. He is a research fellow with Media Matters, and he covers the conservative.
We can certainly
movement.
afford it, and we should probably spend
I'm gonna
more,
let
not
Max
less, I think,
introduce
on voting.
himself and his video. Okay, welcome, Max.
Look, it's not been the most competent administration in history.
I'm hoping this all works out. I'm going to have to bring up the video on YouTube. But basically,
Don't think
the
I need to
reason I
defend
did
the
this video, which is of the
corporate dominance of
Conservative
everything in
Political
America.
Action Conference, the flip side of this, is that I've been covering the conservative movement.
I'd be more than happy
Christian
for
rights,
conservatives
the
to be
anti-immigration
judged
movement
by the
for
results.
About 4 years.
Now, here's
I've
what I
seen
want
so
you all
much
to-
crazy crap. I mean, the idea came to me when I was prostrated on the floor praying for Terry Schiavo with 100 Christian right activists, with the enormous posterior of former Congressman William Dannemeyer directly inches from my head. This is a guy who had submitted a memo listing 12 people that President Clinton had murdered. And I look up, and I'm looking up Phyllis Schlafly's skirt. Yeah, I'm not. And you know, besides realizing that the conservative enterprise was about to crash down once this was made public, I wrote about it in an article, and I wrote about how, for instance, Senator Tom Coburn's chief of staff, Michael Schwartz, had told me at this conference that not only did he want to impeach liberal federal judges, but he wanted to impale them as well. That I couldn't communicate this through print, partly because there's so many people who don't like to read out there, and that I had to do a video that could show conferences like this, or conferences where I had to pass through an FBI cordon to discuss the Jewish question with David Duke, things like that. And so this is sort of like the product of that idea, and it exceeded my wildest expectations, because when you challenge conservatives, they're used to sort of existing within this right-wing pseudo-intellectual hothouse where nobody challenges them, and they react in strange ways that you can't even imagine. So in this video, you'll see me challenging some of the most prominent conservative pundits on their own bullshit. And I now present to you CPAC 2007, the unauthorized documentary, hoping that it technically works.
This is Michelle Malkin. She's written In Defense of Internment, justifying the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and essentially saying that we should institute the same policy towards American Muslims during the War on Terror. And so we're going to get her to sign this picture of Manzanar, the Japanese American concentration camp. Hi, Michelle. Hi, I'm Max Blumenthal from The Nation. I love your book, In Defense of Internment. I was wondering, can you make this out to Max? Well, what's the problem? Well, why not? So this.
Let me tell you something since you are knowing this. I am all for honest intellectual debate. I had extensive exchanges with critics of my book. I put up an errata page. I invited the major.
You had to issue errata?
Excuse me. Exactly. I did.
So you made a lot of errors in
I
your
made
book?
a lot of errors and I absolutely detest your initiative in trying to smear my work without even reading my book. Thank you very much.
That was a good speech, Malcolm. Now, I was wondering if you learned any lessons journalistically. There she goes. The mood of the crowd at CPAC was subdued, to say the least. In the wake of Republican midterm losses and in the midst of several disastrous military campaigns, the conservative coalition that had ushered in several Republican administrations showed signs of breaking. The conservative movement was in crisis. Amongst presidential candidates appearing at CPAC, only Tom Tancredo could boast of a solid conservative voting record. Whether Tancredo's brand of conservatism helps his party is another issue.
Conservatives need a leader that believes in enforcing our immigration laws because the first part of illegal immigrant is illegal. Sort of a linguistic and cultural Tower of Babel. I believe it is. Or I guess you could also just ask them whether they think Miami is becoming a third world country.
These reactionary governments threaten to destroy Republican efforts to make inroads in minority communities.
I mean, some of the stuff I heard today I was shocked to hear Republicans talk about immigrants in such ways because, immigrants are becoming the majority in America. It's kind of hopeful, but, I
Have you
guess
ever
we just
considered
agree.
this is a white man's party?
Yeah. And sadly,
The idea that being an immigrant basher was good politics should have been put to rest in '06. I would argue that if the face of the modern Republican Party is Tancredo, it loses over the next 25 years.
One more passage of amnesty or guest worker program, and we are done for politically. It will never, because politically it will never be possible again to control it.
What about culturally?
Huh?
Culturally.
Well, and obviously there's a cultural problem.
We need to preserve white culture.
White culture. Get the hell out of here with that shit. White culture. You get out of here. You want to get some racist chant for Tancredo? It's bullshit. That's not gonna happen. It's not about race.
Can we see your Confederate flag about? Why are you covering it up? What's wrong with the Confederacy? Was a Republican? Even this curiously pale black Republican. Why can't you guys get more black Republicans elected in black districts?
Because most almost all legislative districts that are set up in inner cities are safe black Democratic seats.
Perhaps the only
y'all give it up for Max Blumenthal here. What an amazing, he's one good-looking fella. That was great, Max. And actually, it was just, I was having this sort of flashback because about 12 years ago, I was here at this very same hotel for the Christian Coalition Road to Victory conference. Anyone else there? Okay, it was memorable because I remember I was standing in line in my best sort of, I don't know, I was wearing like some kind of, exactly. And I'm in the L to R line to get my registration. And I look over in the A to F line, and there's Al Franken standing there waiting to get registered as well. And it was great, and no one knew who he was, and those were the olden days. But it's just kind of wonderful to think, okay, now who's the biggest conference at this hotel? It's the Take Back America conference now, 3,000 strong. So anyway, it's just kind of a nice little bit of irony. And frankly, after being on the receiving end of the far-right movement for years, it's pretty darned exciting to be here to celebrate that after years of experimenting on the American people, we can soundly say that conservatism in America is on the way out. And, or as we say in Texas, you can stick a fork in it because it's done. It's done. But I think it's important as we frame up this esteemed panel that this is not just the failure of this administration or of one president, but of an entire governing philosophy that has had an extreme influence, an indelible mark on the American people and on the world. And I think it's notable in these three areas. One, it's been a government above the law, from Iraq to Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib. It's been a government for the very few at the expense of the many, from Enron to the growing gap between rich and poor to the failed and misguided and totally unsuccessful efforts to privatize Social Security. And it's been a government driven by a right-wing ideology, from Terry Schiavo, as was mentioned, to trying to end stem cell research, to a new majority on our Supreme Court, who for the first time since Roe has declared that they will now allow politicians to intervene in the most personal, private medical decisions a woman has to make in her life. But the good news is that despite a decade more of domination by the far right agenda in Congress and in the media and in the political arena, they have been unable to bring the American people along. And I think the most important news here this week is that after years in the wilderness, progressives are finally on the offense and we're not playing defense anymore, which is pretty great. And I think that, and that really is the news of this conference this week, which is that as the far right moves aside, progressives are ready to lead, and the people of the country are ready for what we're bringing to them. I think a common sense approach to government, bringing us together rather than driving us apart, ending the war, creating affordable health care system, and restoring the land and air and water for our kids and our grandkids. I think what's important about what we're going to talk about today is that we do have this moment to lead as progressives, because candidates and elections may come and go, but the progressive movement continues on. And this week you're going to hear from the best and the brightest in that movement. So here to give us their perspective on the ascendancy of progressivism and decline of conservatism, we have a very distinguished panel. And I'm going to read you their bios and then let them get up one by one. First, I want to introduce Rick Perlstein. He's a senior fellow. Want to just wave? You guys can wave as you're introduced. There you go, Rick. He's a senior fellow at the Campaign for America's Future. He's an expert on the subject at hand, having written Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, which won the 2001 Los Angeles Times Book Award for History. He's currently writing a sequel, tentatively titled Nixon Land, The Politics and Culture of the American Berserk, 1965 to 1972. And from 2003 until 2005, he covered presidential campaigns as chief national political correspondent for the Village Voice. Right next to him is Connie Rice, a prominent civil rights lawyer and founder of the Advancement Project in Los Angeles. She's renowned for her unconventional approaches to tackling inequity and exclusion, and has successfully co-litigated class action civil rights cases, winning more than $1.6 billion in policy changes and remedies during her 9-year tenure in the Los Angeles office of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Will you please give her some applause for that? Connie will have an interesting perspective on the current administration as cousin to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And she's received more than 50 major awards, including the 2001 Peace Prize from the California Wellness Foundation and the 2002 John Anson Ford Humanitarian Award from LA County. To my far, far left, Harold Meyerson had a long and distinguished career. He's executive editor of the American Prospect and a columnist for the Washington Post. And from 1989 through 2001, when I first got to know Harold, he was executive editor and chief political columnist for the LA Weekly. Harold has been thinking about this topic for a very long time, starting in the late 70s when he was a political consultant for a range of progressive causes and candidates. And over the years, he's written extensively on politics, labor, the economy, foreign policy, and American culture. So we're glad to have Harold here. And then, not to my right, but at the end of the dais here is Melody Barnes, the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. Melody served as Chief Counsel to Senator Edward Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee and has come face-to-face with the conservative agenda as Director of Legislative Affairs for the U.S. EEOC. She was also Assistant Counsel to the House Judiciary Committee on Civil and Constitutional Rights, where she helped enact into law the Voting Rights Improvement Act of 1992. Glad you're here, Melody. Okay, and so now we're going to start. All right, come on up.
Hello. Meeting adjourned. What else is there to say? We all know that conservatism has failed. What I think I have to contribute, having studied the conservative movement for about 12 years now, is the insight that I've come to that conservatism will always fail. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of conservatives. If you ask conservatives, they'll talk about social conservatives, business conservatives, free market conservatives, open borders conservatives, round them all up conservatives, philosophical conservatives, intellectual conservatives, whatever kind of conservative Ann Coulter is. But I've never met one of them in all my interviews that didn't agree with something that Ronald Reagan said in his 1981 inaugural address. He said, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. Now, I've been doing some sightseeing this weekend in Washington. I live in Chicago. And just one of the places I've gone to was the Library of Congress, the greatest library in the world, perhaps the greatest library in the history of the world. And not only that, if you've never been there, in their glorious reading room, probably the most beautiful building in the world. And as I was wandering around there, I thought to myself, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. Is this guy crazy? So, looking at some notes. Liberals have been doing a lot of looking for slogans these days. Here at the Campaign for America's Future, we've been doing a conservative failure project. And our slogan is that people who profess their contempt for government cannot be trusted to govern. I mean, it seems pretty basic. And the problem is not Bush. The problem is not Iraq. The problem isn't Terry Schiavo. The problem isn't the deregulation during the Bush administration that I've labeled E. coli conservatism. FDA inspections down 75%. I wonder what's going to happen next. The problem is the conception of conservatism. Conservatives talk a lot about principle. They say, we're not Republicans, we're conservatives. That means we hold to certain ideals and certain principles. What I find so fascinating, and one of my kind of biggest insights in studying and talking to conservatism, is that liberals and conservatives mean something different when they define the word principles and ideals. When a liberal says that a politician is principled or idealistic, they tend to mean that they believe in openness, in honesty, in disinterested administration, in expertise. When conservatives talk about principles and ideals, what they tend to mean is there's a certain set of outcomes they'd like to achieve. And a principled conservatism conservative is basically someone who's willing to do almost anything to achieve these ideals. When I talk to conservatives now, conservatives have a very developed history of their movement. They have a very self-conscious story about how conservatives started, how it evolved. I like to ask them this: why is it that whenever Richard Nixon wanted someone to break the law, bend the law, intimidate an administration, like Dean Birch did when he went up to the executives of the major networks and said, play our way or we're going to get rid of your licenses, why did he go to someone whose background was in movement conservatism? Often in the Barry Goldwater campaign. I'm never able to get a good answer. These are people like Howard Hunt, Gordon Liddy, Robert Marty, and I don't need to go through the names. But here's the question. What are the principles? I go back and forth. I try and drill down to the core of what it is that defines conservatism. And the problem is, after 12 years, I feel like I haven't figured it out. I mean, is it tax cutting? Well, the period I studied most closely, the early 60s, John F. Kennedy proposed a tax cut, and conservatives fought it tooth and nail. Their principle was the balanced budget. Right? Is it small government? I drill back even further. And there's a fascinating book by a guy named Morone, I forget his first name, called, now I'm forgetting the name of the book, but M-O-R-O-N-E. And he points out that the first major expansion of the administrative capacity of the American government came with the Mann Act in the early 20th century to fight the movement of young white women over state lines. That's what started the FBI. Then we had Prohibition. That increased the size of government. Of course, the military-industrial complex massively increased the size of government. Is Bush a government? Is Bush a conservative? You hear a lot of conservatives saying now, well, he can't possibly be a conservative. He's increased the size of government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this is a paradox, and this is what I want to leave you with. When you start destroying agencies and administrations, when you reject the idea of a disinterested and competent civil service, then really all you have left is two things. You have government by crony, and you have kind of catch-as-catch-can patchwork government, because there are certain things in a modern society we need to get done. And when you start breaking down the institutions of government and trifling with them, then you make it harder to govern efficiently. So the attempt to make smaller government often makes bigger government. And what are we left with ultimately? With this final thought. I have found at the core of this movement that seeks to find these bedrock principles in the American experience really a certain nihilism. Tomorrow night we have our gala. Jason Alexander of Seinfeld is going to be the MC, which I find really, really appropriate. Of course, he was the star of a show about nothing. Ultimately, after 12 years of studying this, I think conservatism is a movement about nothing. And I don't think that it can succeed, and I implore the American people to turn their back on it and look towards the future. Thank you.
From nothing to something. Hi, I'm Connie Rice. I bring you greetings from California. Harold, you should never have left.
Yeah.
How many of you from California? A few. Okay, so you'll know what I'm talking about. I stay in California and never come to Washington, D.C., where I was born, because every time I look up, I think the country has lost its mind. It started with the statues of naked Greeks, marble statues being draped in clothing. The next time we looked up, because in California, conservatives can't even make it. You actually have to have a recall to get the governor in there. And I make my living suing Democrats, so I have it easy most of the time. It's just a completely different world. And when you look east, I don't know, I feel like I'm Mary Poppins visiting Stalinland or something. You just... It feels like Skull and Bones has mated with the bonfire of the vanities. What are they doing? And then this last year, I thought the election in November, but you look up this last 6 months, and what? Albania is our only ally. 5 years later, the only thing mushrooming is Al-Qaeda's power as a worldwide movement when it was a isolated network 6 years ago. And who knew John Ashcroft was a great defender of the Constitution? You know! Who knew he was in his hospital bed defending? So I figured I'd better come here before it gets worse. I mean, you look at it and it's true. I am not an ideologue of any kind. I don't believe in ideology. It can go haywire, whether it's on the left or the right. I didn't particularly like the famines with Mao and the Stalin's murderous run. You can get to its absolutism, its blind doctrinairism, and you can have it in secular form, which is what Hitler's Third Reich was about, or you can have it in extreme right form, on a religious space. I don't trust anything that's against thinking. And I don't trust anything, and even though that XDR TV, well, we've got XDR conservatism. It's extreme data resistant. You see a report you don't like or racial data that indicates that there's clear discrimination, and you just excise it. You rewrite the scientific reports. I've never seen so many environmental reports redacted with ExxonMobil executives doing the rewriting. I have never. Who thought it could get this absurd? When you take a look at the sort of bones, it's gotten to the point where, when parity is this easy, and when young people under the age of 25, I'm 51, so 25 is young, under the age of 25 are getting their news from Jon Stewart and Colbert, you understand where you are, and thank God they're there, because we're not very good at being funny. And Americans find us boring and uninteresting because we're not entertaining. Earnest and being right isn't enough is the one thing. But I'll tell you what, the conservatives, we think right's being enough. They know wrong isn't enough. And so any movement that requires you to trick people into going along, either through mass distraction or through putting on shows through mass symbolism, it can't sustain itself. And I'm saying this as someone, as I said, I sue Democrats for most of my work, but I also team up with a lot of thinking Republicans and thinking conservatives. I create unlikely alliances to get, it's not 1.6 billion, that was just one case. We've managed to put together through the bond work and our cases, our class action cases, over $40 billion worth of transfer. It's Robin Hood law. We've transferred $40 billion from middle-class systems and rich systems into systems that help the poor. It's marginal work, but all of our work is marginal in this day and age. But I didn't do it with Democrats. It wasn't about party. I did it with people who wanted to solve problems. We did it with people who want to make this country work for everybody. And so I don't want us to get wrapped around the axle of aping them. There are three basic problems with this movement. I agree that in a way it's about nothing, because it requires rage and a sort of warrior's brainstem mentality. It's a brainstem activity. But don't laugh. We need our brainstems. Without our brainstems, we wouldn't know when we're in danger, right? Our problem is that we're upper low. Our concepts don't boil down into slogans and bumper stickers. We're not that entertaining. We like to deal with complex ideas. We actually like policy, and Americans are too busy watching American Idol to listen to policy. It bores them. Bottom line is, if you've got a movement that is based in a sort of mentality that has to have fear. I mean, you've got laissez-faire foreign policy. You have to keep people in a permanent state of fear. Otherwise, if they started thinking about what you were saying and actually looked at the results, you wouldn't be in power for very long. And I think we're at that moment. Any party, and I'll just tell you, I mean, I'm from a family. I think the first time my grandmother put my grandfather on the couch was when he put the Goldwater for President sign out in the front yard. We, of course, were the only African-American family with a Goldwater for President sign in front of the family. We have been Republican before there were Republicans. And my wing of the family is not the black sheep, so to speak, but we got out of step because my dad was a jazz musician player, and that was the music of the devil. So we ended up going off into the wilderness. But I hope this doesn't go on C-SPAN, because the last time I was here, I got in trouble for what I said because it caused Connie problems. So I know from a family base what it means to, Goldwater was very honest. He basically came out and said, in the TVA, and you old people that are poor, you're just going to have to die poor, and we're not doing Social Security because that's a communist plot, and we don't believe in that. And if you want your roads, build your own roads. If you want your cars, and that's my grandfather. So if the airlines want airplanes, let them build the airports. I don't take my money to do it. I mean, it's very honest. Didn't work. So what happened? Well, they spent 35 years figuring out how to disguise it. At heart, it was a wrecking crew philosophy. But when the Americans said, actually, no, we kind of like Social Security, and we like building a ladder for upward mobility, and we actually like enlarging the pie, and we actually want government to create the ladder. We don't really want them telling us what to do in our bedrooms and so forth, but we do want, commonwealth. It's called commonwealth. You do common good, common sense. We want it done. Rejected it. Well, if the American people have told you, no, we don't want you in our bedrooms, we don't want you to, we do want commonwealth, and you've come out with something that said, no, let's destroy that, and you really are a wrecking crew, well, then, you've got to disguise it. And what happens when you disguise it? They got really good at it. And for a while, it tricked the American people. I'll never forget. Here's the party of Willie Horton and David Duke, and they put on a convention that looked like a hip-hop concert. I couldn't believe it. I mean, how do when you talk, so you come up with this sort of Orwellian, it's kind of like a Monty Python's Orwellian circus you do. You label things, and it actually means the exact opposite, the Clear Skies Initiative. Well, the only reason it was going to be the Clear Skies Initiative is because they were going to cut down all the trees and have snowmobiles in the pristine wilderness. You call it the Clean Water Act, and actually you're actually reducing the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. And when you look at the sort of another movie title could be Pirates of the Potomac. I look up and Eli Lilly is in the basement writing the prescription drug, limiting the volume buying of the prescription drugs, and also writing an immunity clause so that when children get harmed by the vaccinations, they can't get sued. You got ExxonMobil writing the energy policy, and we're still, I guess we lost that case, trying to get those. It is, and then you go to the incompetence. If you really want a wrecking ball, what you do is you put on overalls that say repairman. And you still come with the wrecking ball, but you create distraction. You don't let people see, because people aren't really paying attention. And that's what's just so, it's just so disturbing, because I'd rather have them be honest. If you have to trick people, it isn't going to work. And if you have to deny the results of what's happened, it isn't going to last. And I think that those are two of the main reasons that conservatism is bound to fail. But the final one is that actually, when you care so little about policy, and you're really just about deconstructing, not creating and creating progress and not creating something, when it is about nothing, what it ends up doing is it actually creates more of the problem. Every single policy ends up creating more of the problem. We're over in Iraq creating more insurgents every day. I talk to the soldiers who come back. We do the same thing in our inner cities, by the way, the tough on crime, sort of stuck on stupid crime fighting that we have. We spent $25 billion in Southern California alone on locking up over 500,000 children under the age of 18 for the last 10 years. What do we have? We have 6 times as many gangs and 5 times as many gang members. I'm sorry, twice as many gang members. We have 40,000 gang members in the city and 80,000 countywide, and we spent $25 billion. You spend $1 trillion on a war on drugs, and marijuana is the biggest cash crop outside of, more than cotton, alfalfa, and tobacco combined. Now, if you spend $1 trillion on something and it ends up being ending something and it ends up being that's a sign you need to change what you're doing. You actually end up creating far more of the problem than you end up solving. Bottom line, it's bankrupt. It's bankrupt. It's so internally inconsistent. You cannot become and run the thing that you're out to destroy. It can't work. And the bottom line is this country is fundamentally about moving forward. And that's why now we ought to be able to step up with a platform and a philosophy. We need to understand why we don't appeal to Americans. I end up going to thinking conservatives who actually want a smart way to solve a problem without wasting taxpayers' money, and I'm with them. We need to guarantee the American people that we will solve the problem, make it transparent, tell them what kinds of results we're going to get, and then then show them that we're not going to waste their money. It means having to take on some of our friends. I have had to go head-to-head with some of the most progressive people in the country. And I have stood with some of the conservatives on some particular issues, particularly when it meant ending the stuck on stupid sort of brain-dead policies that some of our friends will do because it's all about adult agendas and they're in the way, for example, of building schools for 120,000 kids with no seats in LA. How do you let 120,000 children go without seats? We're in control of those systems. We have to be very honest about the failures that we have failed to fix. We are stuck on stupid in our own way, and until we can show the American people that progressivism doesn't mean stuck on stupid, and that conservatism it's beyond stuck on stupid, it actually creates more of the problem, we have to come out with a very specific approach that puts away the divisive issues and creates the unity, the doctrine of unity. We have had those kinds of successes in California. Harold left too soon, although he was an engine for a lot of it. But we are at a point now where if we keep going down this road, I'm going to go back to California and I'm going to suggest to Fabian Nunez, Antonio Villaraigosa, and the Terminator, the Governator, we need, along with Texas, to have secession at the top of our agenda. We need to take this country back and put it back on the right track. But do not fool yourselves. Do not fool yourselves. Talking to ourselves is not going to do it. We need to understand our limitations. And we also, I would caution you again, I know it's it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to start. You know what our problem is? We're not mean enough. And the problem with going to where they go, because it's a mentality, and I actually think there's a neurobiology to this. I'm not writing the bell curve, and I'm not Jensen and Shockley. But I actually think there's a neurobiology to this, because I've been around so many conservatives all my life and grew up with them. There is a basic persona that is open, that seeks social networks, that has a basic DNA of trusting. There's not a xenophobic, retreating, you're about to hurt me, paranoid strain. That's the other kind of mentality. Now, you need both. It's like brainstem and upper lobe. You need both. But the personas of the folks that I find, they're so afraid. I couldn't figure out what they were terrified about. And I'll never forget in the 209 race, which is the anti-affirmative action race. I'm no big fan of affirmative action, but I was going to be damned if they were going to get rid of it and not replace it with something better. Bottom line was, when we were in that fight, I'll never forget this debate that I had with one of the professors. I think it was Professor Woodward. And he was on the radio with me. He was up in San Francisco. I was in LA, and we were on a San Francisco station. And he said, Miss Rice, you know, I don't hate black people. And I actually like you. But look, all I really want is I just want to go back to the days when there was no race discrimination and no sex discrimination. I had, it's hard to make me speechless. I had to think for a moment because he was sincere. All right? He meant it. When his world was all white and he was a gentleman C professor, gentlemen C white men can't make it to the top anymore like they used to when they had everybody locked out. And they got to compete with Cornel West and Lonnie Guinier and, Rudy Acuna. Sorry, once the doors open, those guys were going to get marginalized. That's who led that. And, the other partner was Ward Carnley, and I like Ward. He's a friend of mine. He's afraid because he's in an interracial marriage, and he's afraid one of his children will choose his wife over him. And I told him, I said, Ward, listen, my family's full of interracial, all kinds of stuff. I mean, we're a third Cherokee, a third white, and a third African. I said, I could write myself a reparations check. I said, relax. I said, relax. I said, relax. You know, here's what happens in interracial families. At age 18, they choose one parent and get the dashikis and the afros. And then at age 25, they all of a sudden, they'll choose the other parent. By 30, they've integrated and they realize neither matters. So don't worry. Don't worry. But that's where that movement came from. It was out of that core fear. Understanding that professor's fear, I began to realize I had to talk to conservative white audiences in terms of understanding their fears. Not with a meanness and a xenophobia and an attempt to annihilate the way they do, but out of a love and an empathy that says you don't need to fear me. Bottom line was that when I had to go, I had to learn to talk to angry white cops. They introduced themselves to me. Connie, we're the angry white guys, and we've got badges and guns. I said, good. I'm an angry black woman. We'll make a great pair. Together, it doesn't look like it from MacArthur Park, but we are getting them to rewrite the cues and the codes and the incentives so that 10 years from now, you'll get a problem-solving cop instead of a robo-cop who is told you have to be brutal, you have to be physically abusive, and you have to show the people that you can suppress them. Understanding what makes it tick and then rewiring it. Now, it doesn't mean we can't have some fun along the way and poke some fun. I love Max. We have to do that as well to show people that we can do that. But the bottom line is, I don't think we're going to win people that way. I think that there is a way. And the last thought I would leave with you, whatever platform we do, look at us in this room. We have utterly failed the underclass and the poor in this country. And I'm going to claim #1 responsibility of saying, I have massively failed. All those awards, all those dinners, and I'm about to get another damn plaque next week for some other stupid award for being top lawyer or this, that, and means nothing. We have left our children in neighborhoods where they can't even walk to school. We don't need to go to Iraq for Fallujah. We've got Fallujah in LA County. There are places, you face a 1 in 10 million chance of being hit by Osama bin Laden or Mullah Omar. The children in Los Angeles, in the hotspots, face a 1 in 51 chance of severe violent attack. 1 in 51 versus 1 in 10 million. And where are the billions going? If your children can't walk to school and in school are not safe, and you've got 40,000 kids signing up for a culture of destruction, ladies and gentlemen, we have failed. And if we don't start hitching our anchor to that level, I'm telling you, the prisons, the gulag we've got in California, it's going to make, what was that prison that exploded in the 60s here in New York?
Attica.
Thank you. A Sunday picnic, okay? We have got to get policies that address both sides and neutralize the fears. Orchestrate what Dr. Martin Luther King said right before he died, his best essay. It wasn't about dreaming. We need to wake up and smell the coffee. It was not about dreaming. His last essay talked about how we had only managed to end apartheid, that we had not achieved integration, which did not mean holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It meant true political and economic integration. And what Dr. King wrote in his last essay right before he was assassinated, defending the garbage workers, right before and it was published posthumously, he said, it will not be enough. This movement can only carry us to the ending of apartheid. If the American people don't create a grand alliance between poor whites and poor blacks, and he would include Latinos, Filipinos, and everybody else in our kaleidoscope this century, if they don't come together and demand upward mobility, jobs and wealth creation, and if we don't harness the reins of a rapacious capitalism, it will consume us all. Militarism, racism, sexism, and rampant capitalism. And he said, if we don't radically, and these are his words, not mine, radically restructure the American political structure and economic infrastructure, the upward mobility, the wealth creation machinery that does not, instead we've cut the ladders off the rung. If we don't return to his vision of a radical reconstruction of our economic and political systems, we may feel good at another damn convention, but I won't be smiling, because I will know we have left most of my clients behind. It is time. It is time to write a platform that reaches that deeply, reaches that widely across. We're not going to get the Phyllis Schlaflys, but we can get the thinking people in this country who want progress. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get smart, let's get strategic, let's get common sense, let's realize that some of us look pretty weird to the rest of the country and understand our limitations. Let's start forging the grand alliance that Dr. King left us with. And ladies and gentlemen, we will take back America. Thank you.
I left Los Angeles so I wouldn't have to speak after Connie Rice. Failed again. Something Connie said reminded me. She was talking about, Republican conventions that, to TV look like they're showing hip-hop videos. I've covered conventions now for 20 years, and I was really struck at the 2000 convention, the Republican convention in Philadelphia, which first nominated then Texas Governor George W. Bush. You always look out over a sea of white delegates, and then there was the biopic introducing Bush, and it was all African Americans from Texas testifying to what a great guy this was. And I remember I wrote at the time that apparently there are two kinds of black people in Texas. Either you're a friend of the governor or he executes you. Anyway, you will recall execution rates in Texas. A little context there. In your packets, you have the brand spanking new issue of the American Prospect, the magazine I edit. And in it, the cover story is the reemergence of the emerging Democratic majority, in which John Judas and Rui Teixeira, who in 2002 wrote a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority, get another bite at the apple, since the paperback version had to be entitled The Slowly Emerging Democratic Majority. But they lay out a pretty clear reason, due to the social liberalism of the young, due to the political sway of independents towards the Democrats' position, why they think there is a political realignment, and then they distinguish as among different kinds of political realignments in our future. So that deals with the political side of this, but I want to talk for a couple of minutes about the intellectual collapse of modern conservatism related to today's economy. Connie was quoting Martin Luther King on rapacious capitalism, and at the time he was very close to the person who I was lucky beyond belief was my mentor a few years later, Michael Harrington, the leading democratic socialist of his generation. And I was just thinking, the rapacious capitalism, and it's a good phrase, but the rapacious capitalism of 1968 was Eden before the fall compared to what we have today. That was a mixed capitalism at a time of, for the ancient among us who can remember this, powerful unions. A time of imperfectly shared equality, God knows, but at least some shared equality in the United States. Ain't none of that to be found anywhere today. And that's a lot of the problem with conservatism right now. I was struck by the new issue of Foreign Affairs, the, July-August issue. There's an article by a guy named Matthew Slaughter, who sounds essentially like someone like Robert Kuttner or me, an American Prospect person, a EPI person, a Campaign for America's Future person, talking about the inequalities in income. He gives a statistical variance between what the people who make an average income, how much they've gained since 1966, and how much the top 1%. It's a difference between like 11% and 121%, little bit of a difference there. What's striking is that between 2005 and earlier this year, Matthew Slaughter was one of an economist serving on the White House Council of Economic Advisors. So even conservatives, to a certain degree, recognize the collapse of the middle in the American economy. But what did they do during this collapse? There was once upon a time in the 1970s, if you go back, when people retired, for instance, they got another archaic bit of Americana, a defined benefit pension. In other words, a certain level of retirement security. 71% of people who got some retirement got that. Today that figure is beneath 20. Most people don't get that at all. So in the middle of a pervasive insecurity about retirement security, what do Republicans do? Duh, they call for the privatization of Social Security. Had they called for this in the 1970s, when people had, at least many people had, a more secure private retirement system, you could understand some political logic, given ideologically where they come from and given how things play politically. To call for this in 2005 was an act of political recklessness that got nowhere. Then, I want to point out to you, that, again, the intellectual collapse of the Republican conservatism precedes the political collapse. There were no more legislative initiatives in 2005, 2006, coming from the Bush White House or the Republican Congress. They ran out of ideas. They had pushed so far to the right, and they had won so much pushing so far to the right, that they were in essence stepping off the edge of the earth. They haven't stepped back yet. And if you listen to the Republican presidential candidate debate, there's very little discussion of this. And I want to talk in my few remaining minutes some about foreign policy. We know the neoconservatism, preemptive war, go it ourselves, charge right in, think that what's wrong with Iraq is it doesn't have a flat tax. We know that vision is discredited. But there's a larger conservative vision, and let us face it, a lot of Democrats share this too, which I would argue is becoming discredited as well. And that is the link between capitalism and democracy. As long as Connie opened the door on this, I'm going to walk right through. It has been writ, W-R-I-T, not, well, anyway. It has been widely believed, and it is still a mantra of George W. Bush, that when you bring capitalism to a country, democracy follows. And let's face it, these were many of the justifications that people in the Clinton administration gave for allowing China to receive permanent normalized trade relations, et cetera, bringing China into the world economy. It's not happening. And we have the emergence of a new kind of state, authoritarian capitalism, in the phrase of someone who was in my notes, and I can't find his name, but he's an Israeli academic. Azargat, there you are. This poses a real challenge to conservatism, but also to many within the democratic orbit. China destabilizes lots of doctrines. And globalization destabilizes lots of doctrines. It is a crisis for conservatism in that conservatism, on the one hand, espouses what lately has become a radicalized and globalized form of capitalism on the one hand, and social traditionalism and nationalism on the other hand. Those do not go together. That is a lot of what the immigrant collision within the Republican Party is about. That is what the Dubai port steal was about. The business wing and the emotional base of conservatism, not just the Republican Party, conservatism are colliding with each other. It's an unsustainable system. Listen to the Republican candidates debating. Never mind, the fact that Congress did nothing when they had total control in the last 2 years. What do they have to say about this? Essentially, as Rick said before, nothing. They have nothing to say about increasing the safety net at home to enable Americans to defend their standard of living. They say nothing about creating the right to join a union again. By the way, the Employee Free Choice Act is coming up Wednesday or Thursday in the Senate. It will not break a filibuster, but it'll be interesting to see how many votes it gets. And it is something that could conceivably be enacted in 2009 with a Democratic president, essentially re-legalizing the right to join a union, not a small thing. Conservatives say nothing about making trade conditional on labor and environmental standards, and nothing about Rick's good concept of E. coli conservatism, which again is globalized. If you saw the Washington Post and the New York Times yesterday, both of them were reporting on the fact that, not that any of us knew it, a huge percentage of our generic drugs in particular are manufactured in India and particularly China, and FDA isn't doing a great job of checking out what's going on there. Indeed, I would suggest, now flying off here into God knows where, that one of the central projects for liberalism in the years and decades to come is globalizing the kind of institutions which were evolved in this country during the Progressive era, the New Deal, and the 60s. That is to say, I think at some point a global FDA makes a great deal of sense. And if you don't comply with it, you don't get to export any drugs. That's just one part of my maniacal global vision, but it's something for liberals to think about because conservatives aren't. Liberals are on sounder ground on these questions. They're good on safety net and union rights, more concerned about the effects of trade. But in many ways, we are not yet agreed with ourselves. We are confounded by some of these paradoxes of globalization. If you go on the American Prospect website, there's a debate between two eminent progressive economists or economic activists, Jamie Galbraith and Jeff Foe, about how much you can bring back the American middle class by building a better welfare state here versus how much has to be done globally. This is not a settled question for progressives and liberals. But conservatives aren't at the point where they even recognize the question. They believe in this conservative synthesis of radical capitalism, nationalism, and traditional values that are essentially mutually negating. They cannot have all of this, they cannot have any of this, and therefore have very little of value to say about the world we live in. Our intellectual challenge, I think, and political challenge, one of many in the years to come, is honing what we have to say about this with the realization that we cannot go back to the national mixed economy, which was the grand creation of modern 1930s, 1940s liberalism, and we need to go ahead to this uncharted terrain of how we deal with this globally. Thanks.
So if you just give me a second and indulge me with a story, I want to tie it into my topic for today. My father is the oldest of 3 siblings, and they grew up in Richmond, Virginia. And I always tell them it is a miracle that you all got out of your youth alive. And that's because they were always finding some way to get into trouble. And here's a case in point. Every Christmas, my grandmother would make a fruitcake. Now, I hate fruitcake. I think there are colors in it that just are not natural. But they all love it. My grandmother would make it, and she would put it in rum, so it would just kind of sit and soak for a while, and she would cover it and put it on a really high counter, and she would say to them, "Do not touch the fruitcake." So when she was gone, they would promptly pull out a chair. My dad would climb on top of the chair, and they'd pick off pieces of the fruitcake. And my dad would hand it down to my aunt and hand a piece down to my uncle, and this would go on for days. Then my grandmother took the fruitcake down in time for Christmas, and it was falling apart. Now, I won't go into what happened to them after that, but I think the point is that with my father and my aunt and my uncle, they were pinching these pieces off, and the whole fell apart. For the conservative movement and their 4 ideological pillars, the pieces just fell off and fell apart. And those ideological pillars, and people have touched on them today, small government, lower taxes, a strong defense, and conservative family values. They've fallen apart. And today, the grand conservative experiment has failed. And I want to talk a little bit, I would love to talk on all of these pieces, but I'm going to just focus on the 4th pillar, that of religion, values, and the conservative family values movement. I think that after years of claiming the moral high ground, that while the religious right is still very, very powerful, let's make no mistake about what the last election told us, they are extremely powerful. At the same time, the failed moral vision supporting the conservative family value movement and rhetoric is finally being exposed for what it really is. Think about Katrina. Remember Michael Chertoff's remark after Hurricane Katrina, and of victims who didn't have cars and weren't able to leave New Orleans. And he said, quote, that they had chosen not to obey the evacuation order, and that, quote, that was a mistake on their part. And I think that comment really exposes the heart, quote unquote, of their vision. And then there was the fallout in conservative ranks as it became clear that their leadership was protecting former Congressman Mark Foley as opposed to protecting the House pages. And then let's not forget the 2006 strategy of using gay marriage initiatives to antagonize and to draw out conservative voters and get them to the polls. And while some initiatives passed in some places, the strategy still didn't net the gains that they were expecting and that they hoped for. And alternatively, progressives, based on our values, successfully advanced living wage initiatives in 6 states. Now, I want to be clear, because I think that this is a mistake, and I think it's a misunderstanding on the part of the public. So on my part, I want to be clear. I am not anti-values, and I am not anti-religion by any means. As I say, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and I grew up in the Baptist church. And I remember believing and understanding in the kind of moral vision that prompted the social justice movements that were shaped by Dr. King, as Connie mentioned earlier, by Cesar Chavez, by Dorothy Day, by Rabbi Abraham Heschel. And that shaped my view about what was important and the power of the social justice movement and the importance of moral and ethical voices speaking truth to power. But today there are at least a couple of things that bother me in this context. First, that right-wing conservatives have used and continue to use so-called family values and religion as a political weapon. And I saw this all the time when I worked on Capitol Hill. And they narrowly focus on abortion and gay marriage to divide communities and often fail to speak to a broad range of values issues that are important to us all, like poverty, like the environment, and healthcare, and the list goes on from there. And secondly, I have a concern about the way that the media portrays all this and portrays this debate, because they don't cover the breadth and depth of religious voices in the United States today. And I think that leaves the public with a skewed perception about what's going on in the values debate. In fact, Media Matters recently did a report, and one of the many points that they shared with us was the fact that when you combine newspapers and television, that conservative religious leaders are quoted, mentioned, or interviewed 2.8 times more often than progressive religious leaders. So what are you to believe when you turn on the television or you read the paper? Now, instead of an empty values debate, progressives, religious and secular, must address the tough moral questions that face us today. Connie mentioned poverty. At the same time, and in addition to that, there are questions like, why did we hang the Katrina victims out to dry? And why is it that there are so many still displaced today, and the nation just kind of got bored with it? What is it, Katrina fatigue? And as someone said once, and I believe it so firmly, the only people who have a right to be fatigued are the Katrina victims. And what underlies the venom that's being directed towards communities like the immigrant community, the LGBT community, and people of color? I believe that as progressives, we have a moral responsibility to discuss these issues and to tackle the root problems. And as opposed to these skimpy policy proposals or non-existent policy proposals and meager reforms that are before us today, we have to offer a bold alternative vision. For example, we at this moment have a real opportunity to do something about poverty. Not just talk about it, not just feel bad about it, but to do something about it. The number of poor Americans has grown by 5 million and inequality abounds. And this isn't just a moral issue, but it's also an economic issue for our country. Recently, my organization, the Center for American Progress, released a report called From Poverty to Prosperity, a national goal to cut poverty in half. We have a 12-point agenda. We want to join with others out there who are doing something about this to cut poverty in half in the next 10 years with a goal to eradicating poverty altogether. The faith community is obviously very actively involved in this, and I could go on, but time is running short, so I won't. Similarly, we're experiencing a growing coarsening of our culture, and I think it's made obvious by the anti-immigrant sentiment that we're seeing across the country. I don't know if many of you have heard about these anti-immigrant games that are being played on college campuses around the country. And there's a group at Boise State, for example, that advertised a food stamp drawing and a free meal at a Mexican restaurant for students who climb through the hole in the fence to submit their illegal identification. What kind of country, what kind of messages are we sending? And I think the conservative movement is in disarray right now, and they're trying to rally their constituencies by fueling the fears and insecurities, and by using the same kind of rhetoric we use around the war against terror in the immigration debate. But the reality is that our situation with regard to immigration is not going to get any easier, that there are 12 million people right now who are living in the shadows, and again, we have a moral responsibility to do something about it and to join with faith communities who are working in this area. And lastly, they're the hardline conservatives who have directed their vitriol towards the gay community and Roe v. Wade. They use gay marriage and access to reproductive health services as wedge issues. And they tell us if you're not standing with us, then you're standing on the wrong side of the moral line. But that's not true. And progressive religious voices are speaking up. And alternatively, 4,000 religious leaders have endorsed the gay marriage resolution sponsored by gay and lesbian advocacy group Freedom to Marry. And similarly, more than 40 religious organizations and denominations have signed an open letter to religious leaders on abortion as a moral decision. And that was written by theologians representing Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic faiths. Again, it's not all balanced in one direction. There are voices that are part of our community that join with us to say these are moral issues, and they join other moral issues as well. And fortunately, we have a growing progressive infrastructure to help get those voices out there. So in the current climate, we have an opportunity, a responsibility to build a progressive movement while solving the significant problems facing our country and healing the wounds of those who are struggling under the weight of those problems. We can make America strong and whole and principled, so let's do it.
So will you please give a round of applause for this outstanding panel here? Bravo! And because we had such a rich discussion, we don't have time for questions, although I imagine many of our panelists will hang around here and be happy to visit with you. If you don't have anything else you're doing there right now, Rick Perlstein's going to be in the lobby, actually, book signing his book, Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus. Is that right?
Yes, I have to run the exhibit hall.
Okay. Oh, he's going to be in the exhibit hall, so please go see Rick. But thank you very much for coming, and thanks, panelists.
Johnson.